Well, Low Crossing Church, how are you doing? Is everybody doing okay? It's good to see you today. Glad that you're here. Hey, this is where I normally welcome all the various campuses that are joining us, but we're going to do that in a special way. So I want you to watch the video right now.
Hey, Quincy! What's up, Macomb? Hey, Kirksville!
What's up?
Hannibal! Hey, 929!
Hey, Lima.
Hey, Peaceville! This is Crossing Camp!
Time, having a great time. Hey, I want to also welcome Mount Sterling. You didn't get to be a part of Crossing Camp this year, but you are next year. And I want you to know that there are about 400 people from our church that are at that camp. I mean, it's just overrun with Crossing kids, and they're just having a great time. So, you know, I think next year, I really believe that next year that can be 600 or 800. I really do. And, you know, God's going to take ground there. Now, some of you are probably remember that last week I said something in church. I said that you didn't want to miss this week because there was going to be something very, very special, right? So that's another video. Watch this video. You know, guess what we're burning? You have no idea. That's the entire Hannibal debt. It's all gone. Isn't that awesome? That means the Orpheum Theater belongs to us. It belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to any bank or anything like that. And that entire campus and everything associated with that campus is paid for. God just keeps taking ground. It's going to be gone before you know it. God's doing it. And you're cooperating, and that's just absolutely awesome. You know, one of the things that last video reminds me of is strength in unity. And actually, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the strength that comes from unity and the weakness that comes when we're not in unity. And it's incredible to think that we can all, as 8 different locations, 8 different crossing locations, can unite together. And after we have paid our bills, and God has given us this increase. He's given us this harvest just through our faith in Him and our ability to trust in Him. All of us can pull together and knock out these debts. That's telling you something about strength in numbers, to strength in unity. And the Crossing being one church in multiple locations. It's powerful to see that and to see what that can do. And nothing against other churches, but when we have all 8 of these that are bound together, it's just like what it says in the Old Testament, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And what is it like when it's 8 strands? I mean, it's going to be a lot harder to break, right? And so there's a lot of strength that comes from that. And I'm so thankful that that's what I see as our DNA at the Crossing, but I really can't say that about our culture. If you look at America right now, that's just really, that is not a commentary that fits America. My son Joey and I were at a zoo a few weeks ago together. We're walking through the zoo together, and there were some people, in my opinion, that were walking through the zoo that I thought probably ought to be behind the cages instead of in front of the cages. That's probably judgmental on my part. But a lot of them were of Joey's age range. And so I just looked at Joey and I said, what is up? I mean, I think probably every generation has said this about the generation coming up. You know, it's like, what is going on? Why all the craziness? What's going on? And he said, well, it's probably rebellion. And I said, rebellion against what? What are you rebelling against? And he's not, but I mean, what am I seeing in the culture with all this rebellion? And we started to talk about that as we're walking through the zoo. And one of the things he said to me, I just really thought, it just really impacted me. And that was, the culture war. He goes, that's your war. It's not our war. And I thought, what does that mean? What does that mean? That's your war and that's not our war. He said, do you know how deeply divided this country is? And I go, yeah, I know how deeply divided this country is. He goes, a lot of people that are my age, they don't want to be lining up to fight each other. He goes, there's more hatred and more anger in this country than there's ever been, except for maybe the Civil War. And he goes, it's not good. It's not good for our country. And so he's telling me kind of his take on it. And I think he's kind of editorializing what a lot in his generation are thinking. And I have to think there's a lot of truth in that. As a culture, when we're deeply divided in the culture war, does it make us stronger or does it make us weaker? As a nation, does it make us stronger or does it make us weaker? I think it makes us weaker. And when people start choosing sides and we're not in unity, I think that's what happens. Unity makes us stronger, but unity is something we have to fight for. It's not something that comes easy. It's sometimes a lot harder to lean out of a relationship than it is to lean in a relationship. But if we lean out of it and we give in to division, it'll actually make us weaker and eventually it could destroy us. And the lesson that we're going to be talking about today, the part of the story that we are in, is where the kingdom of Israel rips in half. It's a kingdom that's torn apart. And it happens because of this. There isn't any unity anymore. Because when we look at Israel, and we've looked at the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks, we've talked about King Saul, and he starts to coalesce a nation, and then King David, and he actually builds that nation, and then Solomon is a reflection of the splendor or the high point of that nation, and then Solomon dies, and then we're where we are today. A kingdom that gets ripped in half. It's fractured. And what it costs them to be ripped in half. And my question is, and you know this from your reading, those of you that are in the reading plan, and we've got plenty of reading plans, you can start any time and just say, well, this is where they are. Week 14, I'm going to start reading this. How did Israel get to this place? How did they get to the place where they end up being ripped in two and there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom and it's no longer united anymore? The answer to that is Solomon. That's how they got there. Solomon may have been considered their wisest king, but Solomon is actually the king that set the nation up for failure. Now that's a strong thing to say because you want to kind of wonder, why would the wisest king, the one who prayed for wisdom and got this God-given wisdom, set his own kingdom up for failure? I don't think he intended to. And a lot of people say, well, Solomon was a great king for most of his life, and then the latter part of his life, he kind of lost it, and the kingdom kind of went into ruin. I couldn't disagree with you more. I would say that Solomon, almost from the outset of his reign as the king of Israel, started that slide. And if you look closer at his life, and I know that we've spent time and we're kind of looking in the rearview mirror through the story, I think you're going to agree with me. The first way, and there's 7 ways that this kingdom eroded. The first way that it eroded in the reign of Solomon was this, that he had an intellectual relationship with God, but he didn't have a heart relationship with God. One thing you see with David, Solomon's father, is he had a heart relationship with God. He may have sinned big time, but that guy loved God. And that's why he was called a man after God's own heart, because he just loved God and pursued that love. It was a relationship that was way beyond intellectual. It was a heart relationship. You read that when you read the Psalms. You just read David's heart for God. And that was lived out in front of Solomon. But Solomon doesn't have that. The entire life of Solomon, as you read it in the scripture, you never get a feeling that Solomon has an incredible love for God. You don't even get a feeling that he has a little bit of love for God. He has an intellectual appreciation for God. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever known people that go to church and that's where their faith is? It's an intellectual appreciation for God. It's like they have an understanding of God, but they're just not in love with him. One of the things that I've noticed that's been so powerful to me since I've been ministering the crossing is saying this, that you can have an intimate personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's emotional, that's heart, right? An intimate personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And I can't tell you how many people have said, I never knew that. I never knew that I could actually have an intimate personal relationship with Jesus Christ. See, that's a love relationship. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, there's a telling scripture that the Apostle Paul gives us. And it says this, and he's talking about food sacrificed to idols. And then he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. You hear that? Knowledge does this, makes me feel better about myself. It puffs up, but love builds up. In verses 2 and 3, it says, the man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know, but the man who loves God is known by God. What's the Apostle Paul saying? He's saying it's a heart relationship. And I think one of the things that caused Solomon to slip, and because Solomon slipped, the whole nation slipped, was he had an intellectual relationship with God and not a heart relationship. The second thing that I see in Solomon is he compromised. He compromised in a number of different ways. Now, if you understand where Israel is geographically, no enemy is ever going to attack you from the east or the west. They're not going to attack you from the west because there's the Mediterranean Sea. They're not going to attack you from the east because there's the desert. And no army from the far east is going to be able to make it across that desert and survive they'll starve to death before they ever get over there. So any army from the east would have to actually go north and then come south. And any army from the south would come up from the south. So the only two ways that Solomon had to protect his country was from the north and from the south. And this is how he chose to do it when you read the story. He made an alliance with Hiram of Tyre. That's Lebanon, that's north. He made an alliance with him. He got all these cedars of Lebanon that he built the temple with and all that from Hiram of Tyre. And then he married Pharaoh's daughter of Egypt. So he made alliances with the kingdoms to his north and to his south, which protected him. But in the process of getting that protection, he compromised his faith. Instead of trusting in the Lord, he trusted in the strength of that northern army and that southern army. And that's a compromise. The third thing that he did was he conscripted labor, which really means he had slaves. And slavery was rampant during the time of Solomon. 180,000 slaves built the temple and the palace. 180,000 of them. And so they built the palace under the scourge of the whip. So maybe on the outside it looked good. Maybe on the outside the temple looked good. Maybe on the outside the palace looked good. But when you think about what actually put it together, it was a pretty horrible thing. You know, when the tabernacle was built, it was built in joy. All the people freely gave of all of the spoils from Egypt, and they put all that together to make all the articles of the tabernacle. And they all worked together, and it was a joyful experience to build a dwelling place for God. But when Solomon took David's money, his father's money, to build the temple, there wasn't any joy in it at all. It was just a building project. You know, there's something very different than a building project than when you do something that reflects the heart and the love of God. It's a very, very different thing. So it may look good on the outside, but it wasn't good on the inside. And while we're talking about that architectural project, that brings us to the fourth thing that started this slide in Solomon. That is that he was a materialist. I mean, he was a materialist. And you say, well, of course, yeah, he had all this gold and silver. Yeah. You know how long it took to build the temple? 7 years. You know how long it took to build the palace? 13 years. So which one do you think he was more interested in? Was he more interested in the temple or was he more interested in the palace? You see, he was a materialist. He was about what was in it for him. So he had an intellectual relationship with God, not a heart relationship. His heart was full of compromise. His heart was committed to just get it done, regardless, like the ends justify the means. That's the slavery part. And he was a materialist. And he had trust issues when it came to God. You see, because he didn't have that heart relationship with God, he didn't trust God. How do I know that? Well, because Solomon had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He fortified 3 cities, Gezer, Hatzor, and Megiddo, so that nobody could get to him. So he was protected. He forgot the teaching of his own father. The teaching of his father is found in Psalm chapter 20, verse 7. Do you know what it says? It says, some trust in horses and some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. What was he doing? He was trusting in the things of man. He was making compromises with the people around him. He was fortifying cities. He was becoming the envy of the people around him. And all that looked good on the outside, but there were problems on the inside. He became the exception instead of the example. That was the 6th thing. The exception instead of the example. He should have took something out of the playbook of Moses, the lawgiver. And this is what Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verses 16 and 17. He said this, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Was that just some advice from Moses, or did he say he must not do this? So what was the problem in Solomon's heart? He considered himself the exception instead of the example. And when he did that, it just messed his heart up. So you can see that even when Solomon is in the midst of his splendor, even at the beginning of his reign, you see this sliding happening inside the man. And it led eventually to idolatry. Now, a lot of people, they just want to skip to number 7. They just want to say, well, you know, Solomon was a great guy and then he kind of got caught up in idolatry. No. Solomon was a guy who did all this other stuff, and eventually that slid him down into idolatry. Now, you know what it says about Solomon? It says Solomon loved the women. I mean, he didn't just have wives. You know how many he had? 700 wives of noble birth or royal birth, and then he had 300 concubines, 1,000 women. And you think, wow, you know, that guy's like some Turkish sultan instead of like a king. It actually says that he just had this incredible amount of love for them. And the reason he fell into idolatry was out of his love for them, because they were the ones that came from the idol-worshiping areas. Here's what I want you to see from that. Solomon didn't have any lack of love. He just was loving the wrong thing. He needed to be loving God. And if he was loving God like his father David loved God, then he would have been a man after God's heart. But he wasn't a man after God's heart. He was a man after all the ladies' hearts. And that's why he ended up the way he ended up. Let's read it. It's in 1 Kings 11, 4 through 8. And I think we need to understand the gravity of what I'm going to be reading right now. It says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Well, let me tell you why these gods are detestable. It's not just that they're not the true God, But Chemosh was a god that demanded, or his priests demanded human sacrifice. Molech was a god whose priests demanded child sacrifice. You had to burn children alive on a griddle in order to worship Molech. Ashtoreth was the female counterpart of Baal. And those two ended up being fertility god and fertility goddess, and so you worship them with male and female prostitutes. This is what Solomon brought into the nation of Israel because he loved his wives. And what was the result? You read the result in the same chapter, 1 Kings 11, verses 29 to 33. It says, about that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the gods of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. That was the result. Ultimately, the fracturing of the nation of Israel was God's judgment upon the reign of Solomon. The reign that so many people looked at and says, these are the glory days of Israel. God was saying, these glory days are going to take you down to ruin, and I'm going to rip the kingdom from you. Solomon was the last king of the United Kingdom. He raised up a guy to be one of his officers, one of his cabinet, named Jeroboam. And Jeroboam ended up taking 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes of Israel. And the southern 2 tribes went to Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And so these two fought one another. Solomon actually tried to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam ran down into Egypt. And the very guy he had an alliance with, that he'd married a daughter, protected Jeroboam against Solomon. Because God was saying, listen, I've had enough of this. I've had enough of this idolatry, and you're going to have to pay for that idolatry. You see, their business was placing their trust in God, and they failed to do that. And our business is placing our trust in God. And when we place our trust in our own wisdom or in our own strength, we are losing ourselves in the lower story. And that's what happened to Solomon. In placing his trust in his own personal wisdom, in his own power, in his own ability, in his own kingship, he got lost in the lower story. And when he was lost in that story, the whole nation went with him. You might think, hey, well, maybe Jeroboam's going to be better. No, he was a man committed to idolatry. And the 10 northern tribes of Israel just became rampant with idolatry. Well, maybe Rehoboam would have learned a lesson from his father. Oh, no. Rehoboam didn't. And the 2 southern tribes, they fell just as much into idolatry as the northern tribes, even more. Do you know why? Because Rehoboam was the child of Solomon and an Ammonite woman. And Ammon, the god of Ammon, was Molech, the god that you sacrifice little children to. And he was produced in that relationship. And so both these guys were committed to idolatry. Now, how did all of that affect the upper story? You know, God has an upper story, right? God has a plan. How did that affect the upper story? Not one bit. You know, I think sometimes we think the things that happen on earth are like cataclysmic. This is terrible. And I know that sometimes we get caught up in it. We watch the news, read the newspaper, and we're depressed. We got to go in the bathroom and cry for a while, you know? We need to take a pill or something like that. Don't you realize that God has the upper story in control, and he'll always have the upper? Do you think that God ever wakes up surprised? Like, really? How did that happen? I should have been watching. God isn't surprised by a single thing that we do. And God, his upper story is always going to happen. And there's nothing in this world that's going to stop it or slow it down or speed it up. That's God's timing. That's God's will. Now we get lost down in this lower story. And what we need to be doing is, as we live out our daily lives in that lower story, we want to lift up, keep our eyes on that upper story, and try to join with God in that upper story. And that's where the joy of life comes from. You see, all of this God's going to use in his upper story. Whether they foul up or whether they do something great, he is going to use it for his upper story. You know what God's ultimate target is? His ultimate target is to bring his son, Jesus Christ, into the world, because he wants to save a bunch of silly people that get lost in the lower story from their sins. People like me and you, right? Yeah, some of you are in that lower story today. Some of you in that lower story right now. It's hard for you to listen to me because you're just all burdened with that lower story. And some of it, that may be pretty legitimate. I mean, you're really hurting, or you're hurting for someone, or there's some sort of thing going on in your family or in your marriage or in your life right now, and you just don't know how you're going to get through it. I want you to take heart. Take heart. Look up. Quit looking down. I remember reading a poem a while back. Two men look through prison bars. One sees the mud, and the other sees stars. I guess it just depends on your point of view. I mean, we're all in the lower story. Might as well look up and realize that the upper story is above us. That our redemption is drawing closer all the time. That God is still in control. That he's never gotten off of his throne. That he has a plan for our life. And it's a wonderful plan. And we just need to be aligned to that plan. You know, I find it interesting how all of this plays into the narrative of God's word. But the very people that Solomon used to increase his strength were the people that destroyed Israel a generation later. You know, he made those alliances from the north and he made the alliances from the south. And both of those alliances betrayed him and betrayed the country. And it's actually a pretty horrible story. Pharaoh came up through the southern kingdom and up into the northern kingdom and ransacked Israel. He destroyed so much. All of those fortified cities, he tore them down. He took those horses and those chariots back to Egypt with him. He took all of his gold and all of his silver. Rehoboam didn't want to lose his kingship, and so he just opened the doors of the temple and the palace for the Pharaoh. His name was Shishak, to take all of the gold and all of the valuables out. There's one particular story because Solomon had this special guard and they all had golden shields. And the Pharaoh took all the golden shields back to Egypt with him. And Rehoboam didn't want to lose face in the eyes of the people, and so he had to make bronze shields to replace the gold ones. Just wasn't the same. And you know, Solomon's reign, and when you think about this wise man, he was wiser than any king, and he was more wealthy than any king, and he was more powerful than any king, and he was more popular than any king, and everybody came to hear what he had to say. Do you know that within a generation, all of his splendor, all of his wisdom, all of his greatness was gone, and it was so far gone that there are some scholars today, biblical scholars, that question whether he even existed. Because there's so few pieces of archaeology that remind us of the reign of Solomon. And is that ever an editorial on a person who lives his life for himself instead of living his life for the glory of God. And that's what the nation endured. Do you know that Solomon's own words condemn him? He said it in the book of Proverbs in 14:12 and in 16:25. This is what he said. There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is the way of death. Boy, it would have been a good thing if Solomon would have took his own advice. And you know what? It'd be a good thing if you took some of your own. And if I took some of my own, right? Because we may know the right thing to do, but knowing it and doing it sometimes are two very different things. What do we need to learn from this? Okay. What do we need to learn? Here's what we need to learn. If you want your life to matter, you need to live your life for God. If you want your life to matter, and if I want my life to matter, we need to live our life for God. And what are some good ways of doing that? Well, here we go. Don't have an intellectual relationship with God. Have a heart relationship with God. Seek that. God, how do I love you more? Help me to learn how to love you. Help me to see you and appreciate you. I mean, God spoke to Solomon and he still didn't have that heart relationship. You need to have that heart relationship, and so do I. Don't compromise. How many times do we compromise with the world and we don't even feel it until we're down the road a long ways, that all of a sudden that faith that was so powerful in my life is just slipping away from me? Don't compromise. Stay true to the Lord. Don't give in to the things of this world. Don't allow yourself that slavery where you look good on the outside, but you're rotten on the inside. Make sure that God comes first in your life. Don't trust in the things of this world. Trust in God. Don't consider yourself the exception. Be the example. And if those things become the truth in your life, then you're not going to go down the road of idolatry. You know, a lot of us do that. We worship lots of things when God's saying, worship me. If you want your life to matter, put God first in your life. Number two, if you want to change the world, fight for unity with others and matter together. There's a big difference between just mattering for God and being with other people who want to matter for God. Because when that happens, you know what? We have the ability to change the world. I think of what Jesus said in John 17. Such a beautiful, beautiful passage of Scripture. Verses 20 and 21. He's in the garden. He's praying. He's about to be arrested. And this is what he says. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. Why? So that the world may believe that you have sent me. You want to talk about a movement? I'll talk about a movement. A movement is when the world starts believing that God sent Jesus into the world to save us from our sins. And when we get together and we are committed to unity, when we commit to that unity, then the world's going to start seeing that. And the world's going to be drawn into that. And they're going to lean into us as we lean into them. And we're going to be part of a movement that's going to change the world for Jesus Christ. You know why that doesn't happen? It's because everybody wants to do their own thing. And you may matter to God, but it's different to be part of a movement of God. See, unity is important. This kingdom will never be the same again. The kingdom of Israel will never be the same again because it was torn in two. And if we want to be a movement for Christ that's going to change the world, we've got to be committed to one another. And we've got to love one another. And we've got to give each other the benefit of the doubt. We've got to help each other. You know why? Because lost people matter to God just as much as you matter and just as much as I matter. Because there is no us and them. It's just us. Right? Really, we're all the same. Just a bunch of lost children that Jesus came to seek and to save. So we've got to be committed to this. We're moving to a time of decision.